So this is the second part of our first lecture where we're going to focus pretty much on Renaissance art, architecture, sculpture, looking a bit at some political developments, but we kind of lay the groundwork for political economic developments during the first half of the lecture. One last thing we should mention is the Black Death, right? So this is going to actually be a major factor in some ways bringing about the Renaissance. So Black Death is like, it's going to have a humongous impact on Europe, about a third of the population wiped out. And among other things, it's going to see a break with medieval artistic traditions, partly because people's attitudes about the church, about religion, about God are going to dramatically change. A lot of people really trying to make sense of the Black Death. Some, kind of embracing their religion more fervently. God's punishing us. We need to earn his favor. We were wicked. But a lot of people are looking around. They're seeing what appear to be, innocents, children, older people, innocent men and women who are dying, being stricken down, and turning them very cynical about God, certainly about the church, organized religion. And so, in terms of art, there's going to be one major aspect of this break is less of a focus on religious themes. And, also we're going to see kind of a transition from art being kind of a craft. And we already talked about, how art would have followed the same pattern that we see in connection with the guild, with shoemakers and other crafts, maybe requiring a bit more skill, but, still it's like you went, started as an apprentice, became a journeyman, then a master. And so now art's can be more about kind of the, the individual unique vision of individual artists. And so that's kind of another major development, partly attributable to the Black Death and other economic developments. Now, if we're looking at, in terms of strictly artistic developments, we might begin with a fellow named Giotto. And this is quite a bit before the Renaissance, but he's kind of anticipating certain kinds of developments that are going to define the Renaissance, not least the simple fact of him being from Florence. He's a Florentine. And we're going to see that, Florentine painting during the Renaissance in the 15th century is going to, in many ways, be kind of at the heart of the whole artistic enterprise, right? Really reflecting a new direction that, again, Giotto's work kind of anticipates. So just looking at one artistic work by Giotto, Lamentation, and, it's a biblical scene, the death of Jesus after his crucifixion, his disciples lamenting him, crying over him. Even the halos would have been very traditional, but there are some important innovations here. First of all, the depiction of human anatomy has gotten better, and that becomes a main focus of Renaissance art, right, to the point of perfection. Secondly, kind of greater sense of the individuality of the different figures depicted in the painting. And finally, a really good sense of kind of depth perception, right? The idea that some things are, this is a flat painting, right? But some things are much closer, some things are just a little bit further back, and then, way in the distance, a tree, a hill. It's not quite perfected, not clear exactly how far back the angels are, but this is a very important development. This sense of depth perception is going to be really important in this work as well, kind of roughly corresponding to the same period, Francesco Traini. So again, we see, kind of a pretty clear sense about how some things are much closer to the viewer, some things a little bit further back, and then way in the distance, a lake, kind of what looks to be mountains on fire. The other thing I think that reflects this kind of movement towards, kind of artistic traditions that define the Renaissance. This is not a religious theme, right? It might seem, triumph of death somehow like, kind of somehow corresponding to the apocalypse as depicted in the Bible. But this painting is depicting the here and now, for that time, right? And, obviously it depends, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, as is interpretation. But the impression I get is kind of, this seems to somehow represent this kind of growing cynicism with religion and God. This is the world he's left us, right? It's in complete chaos, complete devastation. So very bleak, but definitely not a biblical scene, not one glorifying God, or any of the usual themes that you would find in medieval art. Well, that brings us to the Renaissance, and I thought a nice place to start would be this painting by Raphael. This is from the kind of latter part of the Renaissance, often referred to as the High Renaissance, and kind of captures what for contemporaries at that time was the essence of what the Renaissance was about. It was about learning. It was about celebrating their Greco-Roman heritage. And what we see depicted here are pretty much all the major philosophers from the ancient world, like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and so forth. A few other figures worth mentioning in the lower left-hand corner, wearing what appears to be a white turban. Averroes, a very important Muslim philosopher that was quite celebrated in Europe. Definitely when you look at this painting, it's pretty much kind of conveys a kind of uplifting feeling. So if we're talking about the Renaissance as a historical period, right? Roughly, we're talking about the period between 1350 and 1550. Mostly, we're talking about developments in Italy. Though there will be a northern Renaissance, and kind of corresponding to some of the kind of economic developments that we looked at in the first half of this lecture. The kind of the two wealthiest parts of Europe being Italy and Flanders. Italy, of course, we already discussed. There's no unified state, made up of independent city-states. The term Renaissance, which was in fact used by contemporaries, basically means rebirth. In this case, rebirth of Greco-Roman civilization. They really felt they were kind of picking up where the Greco-Roman world left off. And it was individuals, intellectuals of the Renaissance who came up with the term Middle Ages to describe the period between. Also to characterize it as a period of intellectual stagnation, sometimes referring to it as the Dark Ages. Again, historians today would challenge that view as being a bit, kind of simplistic, but that was definitely the perception of the Renaissance. And we should note that, they really took this kind of Greco-Roman heritage very seriously. Certainly this was evident in, a lot of kind of archaeological activity taking place, trying to dig up old statues, sculptures, works of art, architecture, and so forth from that period, particularly in Rome. But also, this really strong interest in pagan philosophy, though, they would try to, kind of make sure to reconcile a lot of the ideas there with Christian thought. But it definitely, collectively, all of these enterprises led to a new way of viewing human beings. If we're talking about the Renaissance, not just as an artistic period, but kind of a broader intellectual one, that's probably the most important and defining characteristic, right? This kind of reconception of human beings from how the human beings were perceived during the Middle Ages, right? Where they were seen as being inherently sinful, but now they're seen as inherently good. I put this map here just so we have kind of a sense of the political situation in Italy at the time. You can see just below Venice, Venice, very wealthy. Just below Venice and a little bit to the left, you have the Republic of Florence, which is really going to play a major role during the Renaissance. The Papal States in the center, kind of a reminder that, that while the influence of the Catholic Church is diminishing and changing, the nature of that influence is changing in some ways, still a major factor in Europe, particularly in Italy. By the way, within the Papal States, the Pope is also a political leader, as well as kind of head of the Catholic Church. In the South, the Kingdom of Naples, that actually isn't going to have a lot to do with the Renaissance in terms of artistic developments, remaining much more agricultural, a bit poorer. And coming back up to the north, you have the Duchy of Milan in light blue. And then, of course, the Republic of Venice, which we already mentioned, right? Both of which are quite wealthy. And it's this wealth, in many ways, that will be driving the Renaissance, right? As people are becoming more and more wealthy, and you particularly have the development of these very wealthy, important towns people, like these very important families. We talked about how many of them will come to dominate government within their respective communities. But they basically have money to spend, right? And so they become important patrons to these artistic figures, basically commissioning them to do these great works of art. Probably most famous in this regard would be the Medici family in Florence, which became wealthy through commerce, real estate, and banking. And in fact, the House of Medici would become probably the greatest bank in Europe, with branches in every major city, and were politically dominant in Florence, right? But what is the thing that we remember them mostly for is their patronizing of great art. And here's an image of Florence today, just still a beautiful city, a reflection of the tremendous wealth that was being generated during this period. And before we look at the art, I do want to just again kind of talk about the Renaissance briefly as kind of a broader intellectual movement. The textbook, I think, does a pretty good job in this regard, right? But the probably most important term, in this regard would be humanism, right? And again, it kind of reflects a new way of perceiving human beings. The Renaissance is not only about art, but about glorifying human capacity, the idea that humans are essentially good. And this is very different from the perception during the Middle Ages. For most of the Middle Ages, human beings were seen as essentially bad, as corrupt, in every regard, in terms of its physical form. Something like the naked human body was seen as indicative of depravity, of sinfulness, of lustfulness, and so forth. The Renaissance, the human body is something beautiful. And they would argue they were kind of in this regard also picking up from where the ancient Greeks and Romans had left off, but also in terms of our behavior, right? For the church during the medieval period, humans are inherently sinful. Pretty much left to our own devices, we're always going to behave in a selfish and sinful way. Kind of the idea Jesus died for our sins because, without his death, it's beyond our capacity to improve ourselves. Renaissance conception of humans in this regard quite different. Humans are essentially good. They did recognize, though, humans do behave badly. And the reason they sometimes behave badly was due to faulty education. And, in other words, human beings, if they're properly educated, and by education, I don't mean simply, just learning stuff about math and science and history and so forth, but learning how to behave, learning how to empathize with our fellow man. If properly educated, then humans will behave in the appropriate way. And in some ways, this reflects our truer nature. I like in Spanish, like they have the perfect term for this, right? When someone knows how to behave in public among other people, to think of other people, to care about other people, we say, buen educado, well educated. Someone who doesn't know how to behave, mal educado, right? And again, it's not well educated or poorly educated because they haven't obtained higher knowledge of algebra. It's more about knowing how to behave as a member of society. Related to this, they also developed the idea that nobles, for instance, are not inherently superior to peasants. It's just that by virtue of being a noble, they had access to a better education and knew how to behave. This would have flown in the face of how most people at the time understood the three estates. I mean, generally speaking, nobles were considered to just be better people. Peasants are slightly superior to animals, and it's not about education, it's not about wealth, it's just who they are. So that's also a very different idea. And we're not getting into that now, but stemming from that would be the idea then that if everyone's basically the same, regardless of what social group they belong to, then we should all be treated equally by the law. That's we're seeing kind of the germination of that idea. It's going to be quite a while, and rest assured, at this point in time, nobles, peasants definitely treated differently. I mean, if a peasant steals a loaf of bread, it's going to go pretty poorly for him. Of course, a noble would never have the need to do that, but if he did, it probably would be treated as, just a bit of mischief to turn a blind eye to. But something is changing here, and humanists, some did actually try to put these ideas into practice to develop a program of liberal studies, with the idea of educating people to behave better, right, to tap into their potential, their capacity for goodness. In the end, it would mostly cater to men of noble class, but they did extend the program to include some among the lower classes, and even a few, believe it or not, women. By way, this was almost like an experiment just to prove that, if you educated a woman, and, again, the general perception was that women were just, inherently inferior intellectually, emotionally, physically, in just about every manner. And so they're kind of challenging that as well, though that stereotype is going to take a lot longer to overcome, sadly. But in any event, right, humanism very much defining philosophy of the Renaissance and will also inform Renaissance art. And that brings us to the art part. So Renaissance art, first of all, focusing on man as opposed to God, as opposed to biblical subjects. Also focusing on naturalism, right? There's going to be kind of a growing obsession with kind of depicting nature realistically. Though I want to be careful with that term, right? Also depicting the human form realistically. But how to say, without any of its warts, right? So it's also depicting humans in nature in a kind of idealistic way as being somehow perfect. So eventually, we looked at some kind of early artistic developments that anticipated the Renaissance, connected with Giotto. His approach of imitating nature will eventually be picked up again in Florence by a fellow named Masaccio. And this kind of marks the beginning of the Renaissance proper. A good example of Masaccio would be his cycle of frescoes in the Brancacci Chapel, one panel of which is depicted here. It might be a little bit difficult to see. It's a bit smaller than it would be if we were in the classroom, but you really see pretty good depiction of the human figures in the sense of really making them appear three-dimensional. And of course, again, this kind of depth perception with some things being closer, some things further away. So kind of picking up where Giotto left off. And then eventually, we really see, we get to a point where pretty much all Renaissance artists, particularly in Florence, which becomes very quickly kind of the center of artistic developments during this period, at least in Italy, but where they're kind of all on the same page, right? And the focus is on two main experimental trends. One is on perspective, this idea of depth perception. And so they're really perfecting, how do you actually get it right? There are two things here. One has to do with geometry. And by using geometry, you can actually get a sense of where, kind of the horizon lies, and then making sure that you kind of accurately depict in terms of depth perception how the human eye would see, kind of a natural scene. It's also about how you organize light and space, right? So, through the use of, kind of lighting, shadow, and so forth, you can really, and then with geometry, you can really convey a pretty good sense of depth perception. And then the other has to do with how you depict human figures, right? So on the one hand, getting the anatomy absolutely correct, related to which some Renaissance artists will actually take to opening up cadavers, dead bodies, to study, the musculature. And they're also interested in movement, right? Like, how do the muscles actually look if the arm is in motion, if someone's running, if someone's just been shot with an arrow and feeling pain, and so forth, right? So, and by the way, by moving the arms and legs of a dead body around, that also becomes very useful for getting that right. And I only mention that because it's really a testament to how seriously they took this. So, a pretty good example of early Renaissance art and its focus on perspective, this idea of depth perception, would be Paolo Uccello's Life of the Holy Fathers. And not getting into the subject matter too much here, the main point being you really have a pretty good sense, and a lot of this involves kind of a developing skill for mimicking what the eye would actually see, a really good sense of some things being much closer than others, some things that are kind of at a midpoint, other things much further away, right? So this is Paolo Uccello. And then this concern with the human anatomy, getting the structure correct, but also being able to accurately portray it in different types of motion. A really good example from the early Renaissance would be Antonio del Pollaiuolo. Here we have the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, and the anatomy is quite correct, but this is also human body under stress, as one would imagine to be the case if a human body has just been impaled with a large number of arrows. So this would have taken a great deal of study of the human form, the manner in which it appears, depending on what is actually happening with the body and so forth. And by the way, that also kind of brings us to another major aspect of Renaissance art, this focus on the human nude. Something very much reflective of this idea of picking up where the classical world had left off. If you're talking about ancient Greek and Roman art, much of it would have portrayed the human form completely nude. At the same time, a major departure from what would have been acceptable during the medieval period, where the human form was seen as something corrupt and depraved and something to be covered up. And of course, that would have reflected a certain kind of biblical notions regarding human nature. And so that kind of brings us to finally the fact that Renaissance art is no longer focusing on biblical themes. A good example with regard to that, if we're looking at early Renaissance art, would be Sandro Botticelli, an important Florentine artist. And here we see, also a really good example of the role played by the Medici family, as he was someone that they patronized. And so Botticelli was really interested in Greek and Roman mythology. So again, a major departure from what would have been considered an acceptable topic for painting during the medieval period. And here we have a really good example of Botticelli's art, a painting known as Primavera, which is Italian for spring, depicting a scene from Greek mythology. But I think even if you didn't recognize it as such, it's pretty clear this is not biblical. It doesn't correspond to any kind of biblical story, which again would have represented kind of a departure from the medieval period. Not all Renaissance art was painting. We should also consider Renaissance sculpture, an early example of which is Donato di Donatello, who studied the classical sculptures in Rome. So also a good example of this idea about Renaissance art picking up where the classical world left off. And in fact, his David is the first life-size freestanding bronze nude in European art since antiquity, since the Roman period. And what's really interesting here, so we talked about how it's no longer imperative that you depict scenes from the Bible, but sometimes they still did. But what's kind of interesting here is there's often kind of a second agenda involved. So here we see, the David is depicting a biblical scene, basically David of the Bible triumphing over Goliath, whose head lies at the base of the statue. But in actual fact, the purpose of this sculpture was really to celebrate Florence's triumph over Milan in 1428. So it's, ostensibly it reflects a story from the Bible, but really it has a different agenda. And you're going to find a lot of art during the Renaissance period that, while on the surface supposedly reflecting some kind of episode from the Bible, very often is about something else. And that would have been readily recognized at the time. Another manifestation of that would be, for instance, portraits of biblical figures that really were portraits of well-known individuals from Italian society, right? So you might have a painting of the Virgin Mary, but in actual fact, it's been modeled by somebody who's a very well-known figure, perhaps in Florence, somebody who has a personal relationship with the artist. And it would have been, very clear to anyone at the time who that individual was. The manner of her clothing definitely would have reflected the kind of contemporary culture. There wouldn't be any attempt at like somehow, depicting these figures in a way that situated them within the, kind of historical biblical past and so forth. Right, so there are still depictions of biblical scenes, but very often really only in the most nominal sense. Finally, if we're considering the early Renaissance, we might consider developments with respect to architecture, which also took inspiration from the classical world. Really good early example would be the dome for the Cathedral of Florence designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, clearly influenced by the architectural monuments of Roman antiquity, and certainly marking a major departure from the Gothic cathedrals that had dominated Europe during the medieval period. The Roman influence is probably even more evident if we consider the interior of such structures. So here we have an example of the interior of the Church of San Lorenzo. So creating a much different environment, compared to what you might find in a Gothic cathedral, where it's kind of seems designed in a way to impress upon the worshiper the remoteness and power of God, the distance between humanity and God. None of this is reflects the sensibility you get when you're within a structure like we see here. Much different kind of environment being generated here. So now we're going to look at the High Renaissance, the final stage of the Renaissance period artistically, roughly corresponding to the years 1480 to 1520. And it really does kind of represent the point at which a mastery of Renaissance technique had been achieved with respect to the different experimental trends that we talked about, right? Where they really have kind of perfected their technique. And it also kind of reflects this kind of transition from art as a craft to something more reflective of, kind of an individual voice, right? Individualistic forms of creative expression. And one other development we might mention here that, for quite a while up until this point, Florence definitely the center of artistic development, but at some point, Rome is beginning to rival Florence as a cultural center. Now, during the High Renaissance, we speak primarily of three artistic giants, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo. Three names I think that, if you're talking to someone who knows very little about art, probably they've heard of these three individuals. And again, really, kind of reflecting the culmination of this transition to, artists being seen as creative individuals as opposed to craftspeople or artisans. Something evident, for instance, in the fact that Michelangelo often came to be addressed as Il Divino, the Divine One. So, looking at each of these individuals in turn, to some degree chronologically, though they do overlap to some extent with one another, we might begin with Leonardo da Vinci, who lived from 1452 until 1519. In many ways, he's a really good example of, the development of certain experimental traditions during the Renaissance. Very famous for dissecting cadavers, human bodies, dead human bodies, in order to perfect his understanding of human anatomy, musculature, how the human body worked. And with him, we really see also the culmination of a trend away from realism to idealization, right? So, very often when we look at Renaissance art, we think, we're kind of struck by how they get the anatomy exactly perfect and so forth. So we think, it's a very realistic depiction of the human form, realistic depiction of perspective, depth of perception in terms of things being further away or closer up. But if you really think more carefully, you realize that all these human forms are in fact perfect. These are not real people, right? I mean, these are like, perfect human bodies, always presented in their youth, always presented, it's as if every model was, I don't know, Brad Pitt or Chris Hemsworth in their prime. And this is not, without intent, right? There is really this kind of idea of presenting nature in its most ideal form, right, as something perfect. One of the most famous paintings by Da Vinci is The Last Supper. So clearly a biblical theme. And, in this case, the primary agenda is to depict this very important event in the life of Jesus, the final supper of Jesus with his disciples. What's really, fascinating about this, however, is the individuality of the different figures presented here. So you really get a sense of not just the personalities of the apostles, but also a sense of their individual relationships with Jesus. And by the way, this is a wall mural. You'd find it on the wall of a church in not in Florence or Rome, but as a matter of fact, but in Milan, further north. Kind of fun fact here. Most of the church was destroyed by bombing during the Second World War. Miraculously, the only part of the church that survived was the wall featuring this mural. So, you decide, divine intervention or just dumb luck. Probably more famous is Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, which, if you want to see it today, you have to go to the Louvre Museum in Paris. This is a really fun painting to consider. It's considered one of the greatest works of art, but it's really on a very small scale. It's a very small painting, and at first glance, I think a lot of people have kind of difficulty fully appreciating why it's considered to be such a great work of art. So if you go to the Louvre and you go to the special room where the painting is on display, one of the things you like to do, unfortunately you're going to be competing with a lot of people in this, is to really just kind of sit there and look at it for a long period of time, kind of ruminate on, what is it about this painting that makes it so exceptional? But, I just want to suggest that the longer you look at it, you really do begin to develop an understanding and appreciation of why that is. And it's, it really does involve a lot of subtleties having to do with the expression of the Mona Lisa. Some of you might have heard that, you really have trouble deciding exactly what emotion is being expressed here, but it feels very genuine. So everything about it, the shape of the mouth, the eyes, which very often seem to move as you move from one perspective to another, is very subtle, but it just captures something, the essence of whoever the model was, that generates a lot of thought and discussion. I put next to it The Lady with an Ermine, another very famous Da Vinci portrait, maybe not quite as famous. This one you would find in the city of Dresden. And I've had the pleasure of seeing both, and quite remarkable, but maybe not quite up to the same level as the Mona Lisa. Next, we have Michelangelo, my personal favorite of the three, who lived for a very long time, 1475 to 1564, and saw himself primarily as a sculptor, but was also quite an accomplished painter and architect. And in fact, he's probably most remembered for a particular painting, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It's actually a collection of paintings depicting the fall of man that he was commissioned to do by Pope Julius II, beginning in 1508. He really didn't want to do it, by the way, but you can't turn down the Pope. Very much depicting biblical scenes, right? And that, there's no kind of deeper kind of second agenda. This is, after all, a very important chapel at the center of, the Catholic world. But it does also, the manner of their depiction does reflect the influence of Neoplatonic ideas, where really trying to show the infinite capacity for goodness of humankind in the manner of their depiction. Probably most evident in this idea that man is created in the image of God and therefore has an infinite capacity for goodness. So here we see the entirety of the Sistine Chapel completed within 4 years. That's pretty good, 1512. With Michelangelo up there on top of scaffolding, lying on his back. And of course, he had some assistance with minor details being kind of, put in around the main images. Probably the most famous scene, of course, is the central one depicting the creation of man. But again, right, you have actually a series of biblical stories being depicted here that, together create a narrative about the fall of man. And so here we see close up for your more careful consideration, the central image depicting the creation of man. Again, note that, the human form depicted here is highly idealized. It really is almost a perfect human individual created in the image of God and representing the infinite capacity for goodness of humankind. Speaking of kind of idealized human forms, probably the most famous sculpture of Michelangelo is his David, right? So the same title, depicting the same biblical figure as Donatello. This one commissioned by the Florentine government in 1501. Again, so it's a biblical scene, but this is actually a better example of where the real agenda is to celebrate Florence and also to kind of celebrate humankind, right? So we see Michelangelo here depicting the human body in all its glory. Human form really doesn't come much more perfect than this. And by the way, this is a somewhat colossal statue. So it's not built to scale. It's much bigger than the average human being standing up high on a pedestal. So, is would be very imposing if you were standing in front of it. Unfortunately, when I was in Florence, it had been taken away for repair. So I guess I'll have to go back at some point. We might conclude our discussion of Michelangelo by looking at two last sculptures. On the left, we have his Moses, which was commissioned by Pope Julius II for his tomb, purely biblical theme in keeping with his purpose, the tomb of a pope. On the right, another biblical theme. This is one that's been done by many different artists. It's known as a Pietà. Pietà always depicting the Virgin Mary carrying the dead body of her son, usually in a state of mourning. I put this here not just because it's a very beautiful sculpture, but it really, I think, nicely illustrates the genius of Michelangelo. When you look at it, your first impression is that the anatomy is perfectly correct in keeping with Renaissance art. But in fact, Michelangelo has, in many places, distorted the body of Jesus in order to create a much more graceful image. If we were to actually depict Jesus accurately anatomically, the body would probably overwhelm the Virgin Mary to the point of, toppling her over. Let's just say it wouldn't be a very graceful image, be very awkward. And so he's distorted the body in a number of ways, to make it much easier for the figure of the Virgin Mary to be cradling the body. But what's really remarkable is that, I think if someone didn't actually draw your attention to the distortions, you would never really be aware of it. Right? So really finding this almost perfect balance between depicting the forms anatomically correct, but making alterations in order for the sculpture to be more pleasing. Finally, we have Raphael, who lived from 1483 to 1520. So actually died fairly young, but fortunately by a pretty early point was an accomplished painter. By the age of 25, considered one of Italy's greatest painters. And this is where we see this kind of movement towards the idealization of nature and the human form kind of reaching its peak, right? So with him, this ideal of beauty surpassing human standards really becomes quite pronounced. He was very heavily influenced by classical ideals related to balance, harmony, and order. I mean, going back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Probably his most famous painting isn't even the whole painting. So here we see on the left Raphael's Madonna, which is in a museum in Dresden, same one as Lady with an Ermine. So I had the pleasure of seeing this one as well. It's actually quite large and depicting the Virgin Mary cradling the baby Jesus. What's kind of interesting, though, is most people probably haven't seen this painting or are aware of it, but they do know about the two little cherubs at the bottom. For whatever reason, those two guys just became hugely popular. I mean, there is an entire industry today built around them. You find their images on T-shirts, calendars, coffee mugs, you name it. I'm not sure that's what Raphael intended, but yeah, those two guys have become pretty famous. But bear in mind, they're really only a small part of a much larger painting, and they're not even the central image of that painting. We might conclude our discussion of these three giants with Raphael's School of Athens, a painting we actually saw at the very beginning of our discussion of Renaissance art. And this one, encapsulating everything that the Renaissance supposedly represented, depicting here all the great philosophers from the classical world, plus a few additional figures. We talked about how you can find the Muslim philosopher Averroes in the lower left-hand corner. And of course, there are continuing developments with respect to architecture during the High Renaissance. Probably the most famous structure built during this period would be the Basilica of St. Peter's, commissioned by Pope Julius II, designed by Donato Bramante. Apparently, he originally had intended to give the commission to Michelangelo. They had a bit of a quarrel, and he withdrew it. So, I mean, this is architecture on a grand scale, but of course fitting given that this is the central cathedral of Catholicism located in the Vatican. And by the way, the architecture of this structure extends to much of the surrounding area, including St. Peter's Square, which we see here, and this would be right in front of the cathedral. At this point, I'd like to consider developments further north, right? So we had talked about, kind of economically how Italy was becoming very wealthy, and that became a major factor in the development of Renaissance art. And we had mentioned that there were certain parts of Northern Europe that were also becoming kind of economic powerhouses, generating a lot of wealth. One of them was Flanders. And so that area is going to become the center of what is often referred to as the Northern Artistic Renaissance. A little bit different than what's going on in Italy. But again, kind of the same basic idea that, you now have individuals with money to burn and they're going to spend it patronizing artists to produce great art. Now, painters in the north did not have large wall spaces to work with, as were common in Italian churches. So that is going to kind of constitute a major constraint in terms of the kind of artistic developments that take place. Artists there had to work with smaller spaces, so they become more about detail than about, like scientifically arriving at a kind of perfect sense of perspective. Gothic cathedrals in the north tended to be taken up by stained glass windows, right? So you really didn't have much wall space. The emphasis would often be on illuminated manuscripts, right? So this is like really art on a small scale. Or the wooden panels of altarpieces, right? So a little bit larger than, the kind of space you might find in a manuscript, but still considerably smaller than what is often the case in Italy. But one really important painter of the Northern Artistic Renaissance would be Jan van Eyck, based in Flanders, a region in the north, as we discussed, that was becoming very wealthy and correspondingly became an important center of the Northern Renaissance artistically. Van Eyck, a painter, one of the first to use oil paint, And he's like a really good example of what defined Northern Renaissance art, right? This kind of attention to detail, and somehow conveying realism in that manner. I mean, the Northern Renaissance artists never really master perspective and proportion, right? This kind of getting a good sense of depth, of some things being closer, some things further away. Never really master human anatomy, but they get really good at detail, right? So through empirical observation, like really carefully studying the subject matter they're painting and getting all the major and even a lot of the minor details in there. One other thing that characterizes art was a lot of it centered around religious feeling, what we call devotional art. And so we always tried to capture the emotional intensity underlying this, right? So that also became a part of this kind of detailed orientation with respect to painting. One of his most famous paintings is Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride, and this really gives you a good sense of the level of attention he gave to detail. I mean, it's really intense here. If you had the actual painting in front of you, I'd probably draw your attention to the mirror in the back, where he really gets a lot of the details of what would have appeared in the image, right? Reflecting kind of what you can't see in the front of the painting. His sense of perspective is definitely uncertain. I mean, it's not awful, and to the untrained eye, it might not be evident right away. But he never really gets this exactly right. But the level of detail is really intense. And I'd like to conclude our discussion of the Northern Artistic Renaissance and Renaissance art in general with probably the most famous artist of the North from this period, Albrecht Dürer. So he's not from Flanders. He's from the German city of Nuremberg. What's really cool about him, so he really mastered this kind of level of detail, this kind of emotional intensity, all the things that define the Northern Artistic Renaissance. But then at some point he traveled to Italy, where he mastered the techniques that they had developed there as related to perspective and proportion. So with him, we really see kind of a combining of these two different kinds of developments within his art. And by the way, the painting on the left is a self-portrait. And I don't know, it just seems like, this guy probably knew how to party, just my opinion. So I'll finish up here with two important works of Dürer. The one on the left I've actually included here because I think it really nicely illustrates this kind of combining of techniques from the North and from Italy. Certainly you have a high level of attention to detail, typical of the Northern Artistic Renaissance tradition, but really, doing a good job of creating a kind of, depth perception, the sense that some things are close up, some things further away. Pretty good job in terms of human anatomy. I'm not sure if it's evident. If you look at this carefully, you can kind of see the underlying geometry that allowed him to achieve this good depth perception, right? So the main figures kind of form a circle that as you move backwards towards the upper right-hand corner, becomes kind of a cone, like a triangle on top of a circle. And that's kind of what allows him to get the depth perception correct here. On the right, at the end of the day, the main reason I'm including that particular image, and it's also a sculpture, by the way, known as the Praying Hands, probably his most famous work. And it's actually quite remarkable if you think about it. With these two hands praying, he's actually been able to convey a high level of emotional intensity with respect to religious feeling. The anatomy of the hands is perfect. The level of detail is quite high, but all in a very subtle way, right? Like when you look at this, your first reaction might be, how can that be considered a great work of art? But it really speaks to a lot of people. And so it's going to actually go on to become quite popular, in terms of being reprinted or kind of having other people create models of the original sculpture and so forth. In any event, we're going to stop there. That concludes chapter 15, and I'll see you with chapter 16.